Well, here it is, the moment we've all been waiting for, news on what Pope Leo XIV would do on the question of the Latin Mass in that document from Pope Francis, Traditionis Custodes, restricting access to the Latin Mass at the parish level that he implemented several years ago. We have been waiting to see what would the new Pope, Pope Leo, do about this. Would he continue with the direction of Pope Francis, or would he reverse course on Traditionis Custodes and open up accessibility to the Latin Mass, sort of like Pope Benedict XVI did with Summorum Pontificum? Well, we no longer have to wait. We now have an answer to our question. It is now breaking news. It has been confirmed. Pope Leo XIV is going to uphold Traditionis Custodes and continue restriction on the Latin Mass according to the terms of Traditionis Custodes, and therefore he is not going to reverse course on the decision of Pope Francis. We're going to take a look at why, what we know, and what this means for the life of the Church coming up next on the Michael Lofton Show. I want to remind everybody, hit the subscribe button and also hit the like button. I would really appreciate your support for the channel. And please also hit the bell for notifications so you know when I go live, because I know a lot of people aren't receiving that notification. So go ahead and do that for me. Take a moment right now if you don't mind. Now, like I said, breaking news. We have been waiting to see what Pope Leo would say. In fact, a lot of people who are very, very critical of Pope Francis during his pontificate have been a little bit more reserved so far during this pontificate, because they have been waiting to see what he would do about the Latin Mass. And if he would open up its accessibility, from what those critics have been saying, they would be a little bit less critical of the papacy. But it didn't go that way. So I do wonder if things are about to significantly change for Pope Leo XIV with some of those critics. Now, let me show you the news so you can see that this is not fake news. This is verifiable. This is according to the USCCB, so the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. They just posted this on their website, posted today. Nuncio, that is the representative of the Pope in Britain, says Pope won't overturn restrictions on Old Latin Mass, the Tridentine liturgy, the liturgy of the Missal of 1962. The news about Pope Leo XIV and the pre-Vatican II Mass following the plenary assembly of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales is not so new after all. You'll see why. Pope Leo XIV does not intend to overturn Pope Francis's limits on celebrating the traditional Latin Mass, but will grant 2-year dispensations to bishops who ask, according to the nuncio, which is not new. That's already been in place. That's already been the case. In other words, he's making no changes. He's upholding the existing decision. Archbishop Buendia, the Apostolic Nuncio to Great Britain, told bishops yesterday, November the 13th, that Pope Leo told him he would not abrogate Traditionis Custodes. Pope Francis's 2021 letter greatly restricting the celebration of Mass according to the 1962 Roman Missal, the Latin liturgy in use before the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. The Vatican press office did not respond to a request for comment, which is not unusual, right? This is very, very, very typical of the Vatican press office. Unfortunately, I don't think that's a good thing. But the Archbishop made headlines by telling members of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales that the Pope would grant bishops who requested a 2-year renewable exemption. So that's not news. I mean, this has already been the case. It was already the case under Traditionis Custodes that each bishop would submit a report to Rome, and if they want to continue it at the parish level, Rome would evaluate the situation and make a temporary decision that can be renewed every 2 or so years. And if Rome wants them to continue in that particular diocese, they will. If they don't, they remove the access. The exemptions are nothing new, a Vatican official told Catholic News Service today. This is no more than a restatement of the practice of the dicastery for divine worship and the discipline of the sacraments since the motu proprio Traditionis Custodes came into force. What the nuncio is clearly referring to is the necessity for a diocesan bishop to request a derogation from Traditionis Custodes in order that Mass, according to the Missal of 1962, can be celebrated in a parish church. The subsection referred to by Monsignor Murphy says that a bishop can designate one or more locations where the faithful had been celebrating the older Mass, and they could continue doing so, not, however, in the parochial churches and without the erection of new personal parishes. In late October, various Catholic news outlets reported that the Diocese of Cleveland, led by Bishop Edward Malesic, had received permission for the older Latin Mass to continue at 2 parish churches in his diocese. In July, Bishop Michael of Angelo, Texas, San Angelo, Texas, confirmed that he had made a similar request, which was granted, but then we've also seen other requests that were denied under Pope Leo, right? So much like Pope Francis, some requests were granted, some were denied. The same with Pope Leo so far. Pope Leo also personally granted permission for U.S. Cardinal Raymond Burke, a former Vatican official, to celebrate the older form of the Mass in St. Peter's Basilica in late October. So Pope Leo, if you recall, gave permission for that on the same week he gave permission for the LGBTQ procession in Rainbow Cross to be processed into St. Peter's Basilica. When Pope Francis issued the restrictions, he declared the liturgical books promulgated after the Second Vatican Council to be the unique expression of the lex orandi, the law of worship of the Roman Rite. Restore the obligation of priests to have their bishops' permission to celebrate according to the extraordinary or pre-Vatican II Mass, and ordered bishops not to establish any new groups or parishes in their dioceses devoted to the older liturgy. At the time, Pope Francis said his decision was meant to promote the concord and unity of the church. Okay, so this is going to be a massive disappointment for very, very many. Some are going to be happy with it. Others are going to be incredibly upset, and there will be a few who are somewhere in between. A lot going on here. I want to explain why Traditionis Custodes happened, why Pope Leo most likely made this decision, why people think this, some think this is a good direction, others think this is horrible, and what some potential consequences are going to be to this breaking news, which is probably, in my estimation, one of the biggest moves from Pope Leo in his pontificate so far. And that is because everyone was waiting to see which direction he would go on this particular question, and we'll see why here in a moment. Now, I do have to point out, I did say, for better or worse, whether we like it or not, I did say Pope Leo was going to do this. Why? Not because I'm a prophet, but because it's incredibly easy to see what decision he would make when he has the opportunity as Pope, in light of his decisions that he made as Cardinal, and really also so far as the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. So for me, it doesn't come as a surprise, but for some people it will, because they were really holding out that this would be the defining moment of Pope Leo and that he would reverse Traditionis Custodes. Well, here's why he did it. Well, you have to ask the question, first of all, why did Pope Francis have Traditionis Custodes? Okay, whether you agree with the reasons or not, whether you think it's a great document or not, let's just ask the question, why did Pope Francis implement Traditionis Custodes back in, I think it was 2021? He tells us why. He says it's actually two reasons. Number one, Pope Francis felt that there were some Latin Mass communities that were weaponizing the liturgy. What did he mean by that? He felt that they were taking the liturgy to say, you know, we're the real church. We have the real liturgy. This other new liturgy is not as good. It doesn't give as much grace. Some might say, well, it's not even valid, or, you're just a modernist if you're part of this new liturgy, but you're a real one. You're a real Catholic. You're truly traditional if you hold to this other liturgy. Now, this was not the position of everybody in the Latin Mass community. I mean, there's plenty of people in the Latin Mass community who just abhorred that perspective, right? But there were some who held to that view. And what Pope Francis was saying is that when he surveyed the bishops of the world, which the survey was very disputed on its results, people have questioned the results of it, he said that the bishops came back overwhelmingly saying that they wanted to see more restrictions on the Latin Mass, because the bishops of the world were saying that people in their dioceses were using the liturgy on the whole as a point of dissent, to reject Vatican II, to say that they're the true church, to say that they have a better liturgy, to say that their liturgy brings more grace, that it's their true liturgy. A number of grievances were expressed by these bishops. Again, how accurate they were, how representative was this really of Latin Mass communities? We could continue to have that discussion. I'm just simply telling you what Pope Francis was saying was the reason behind it. So he felt that people were weaponizing a good thing. They were taking a good liturgy, but then using it as a weapon against the post-conciliar magisterium. That was one reason. The other reason was to bring about uniformity to the Roman Rite, because historically the Roman Rite was one liturgy. There wasn't, this ordinary form and extraordinary form. Now, you look at some other liturgies, like Byzantine liturgy, for example, you have different modes, right? You have different liturgies. You have the Divine Liturgy of Chrysostom, Divine Liturgy of Basil, and another one of St. James. And so, some other ecclesiastical communities, whether in the church or outside the church, sometimes have these different forms of a particular liturgy. But the Roman Rite, prior to the council, had that one form. And then after the council, two forms, an extraordinary form and an ordinary form. The Missal of 62 versus the Missal of 69, promulgated by Pope Paul VI. Pope Francis felt that that was creating division within the community, and was saying that the bishops felt that way, that it was creating division. And because of that, he wanted to bring unity to the Roman Rite and unity to the Latin Rite churches. One second. So those were the reasons. Again, whether you agree with them or not, was the motivation that he said drove his decision. And again, Traditionis Custodes, Pope Francis said that he will allow for some liturgies at the parish level to be the Latin Mass, if the bishop submits the request to Rome, and then Rome looks in the situation and deems whether or not it's fitting in that parish or not. But that this wouldn't be some long-term decision, but would kind of be a temporary concession for those communities who feel more attached to that liturgy. And so in some cases, the liturgy was approved on a temporary basis and then no longer renewed after a certain period. In other cases, it was just not renewed at all, not approved, and the Latin Mass community went away with. Now, this doesn't touch on societies, priestly societies, right? So FSSP and stuff like that, they were allowed to continue irrespective of Traditionis Custodes. Traditionis Custodes was just for Latin Masses at the parish level. Okay, so that is why Traditionis Custodes happened, whether you like it or not. It is what it is. Pope Leo XIV, most likely, based on, I suspect, on his own observations and also based on his advisors, most likely came to the same conclusions that Pope Francis did. Again, whether it's the right conclusion or not, I'm sure he came to that conclusion for the same reason. And for that reason, decided to say, okay, I'm not going to reverse Traditionis Custodes. Despite, I think, a lot of people pressuring him to do that. I suspect Cardinal Burke, meeting with him in Rome, was encouraging him to do so. Cardinal Sarah was probably encouraging him to do so. Cardinal Mueller, among others, were probably encouraging him to reverse Traditionis Custodes and open up more accessibility to the Latin Mass. And they were probably hoping for that and probably thinking he was going to do it because Burke was just given permission to celebrate a Latin Mass for a pilgrimage at St. Peter's Basilica, which hasn't happened since 2022. So I think a lot of people were seeing that as a good sign. Yeah, he's probably going to reverse this. And now the news came, no, he's not going to reverse it. And that's going to be a huge blow to a lot of people, and especially to some of those people who have been sort of quiet about criticisms of Pope Leo, but had been very vocal about their criticisms of Pope Francis. And, just listening to them, they've outright just said one of the reasons why they're less critical of Pope Leo is not because they think he's different, but because they're hoping if he's not criticized as much, he'll open up to the Latin Mass community and open up more accessibility to it and reverse the restrictions. Now that didn't happen, what do you think is probably going to happen? Well, I suspect he's probably going to get a whole lot more criticism than before. Whether right or wrong, whether he deserves it or not, I do think that's going to happen. And we're probably going to see as a situation a little bit more like we saw in the previous pontificate that was very, very unpopular in certain quarters, right? So I want to say this. I understand the reasons for Traditionis Custodes. I understand. Okay, I get it. As I've always said, however, from day one that Traditionis came out, I said, look, I understand the reasoning, but my concern is if there isn't equal discipline in bad Novus Ordos, in liturgical abuses in Novus Ordos, if there's only discipline in some Latin Mass communities, but not bad Novus Ordo communities, there's going to be an issue because it's going to look like targeting one group and not dealing with the source of the issue. One of the reasons why a lot of people went to the Latin Mass is to get away from problems in Novus Ordo parishes. Deal with the root cause, however, and a lot of that dissatisfaction is going to disappear. And people will feel a lot more willing and receptive to embrace the Novus Ordo if it's celebrated properly and in the traditional way. Oftentimes it's not. And a lot of times there's abuses in them, sometimes really severe abuses. But even more than just abuses in the Novus Ordo. I'm just going to continue to harp on this one. I don't care if I'm beating a dead horse. I don't care. It makes no sense to restrict access to the Latin Mass when you're not restricting access to Pride Masses, okay? When you still have Pride Masses going on, this makes no sense. Traditionis Custodes, okay, if you're going to have that, also have a Traditionis Custodes against Pride Masses. Because we have bishops openly celebrating Pride Masses. I've shown this on this channel. We got priests openly celebrating Pride Masses. Unfortunately, Pope Leo himself has sent bishops to celebrate LGBTQ masses in Rome and allowed for the LGBTQ procession in St. Peter's Basilica. That makes no sense. So whatever reasons there are for Traditionis Custodes, let's say it's 100% correct. Let's say Traditionis Custodes is the wisest move ever. Okay. But it makes no sense if you're going to allow for Pride Masses and also incredibly bad abuses in the Novus Ordo. It makes zero sense. You have to be consistent with discipline. So if let's say you have this really extremist person who, they're on the traditional end of the spectrum, but in a really extreme form, in a way that is not actually traditional, but is pseudo-traditional. But they're claiming to be traditional. And let's say they're engaging in all sorts of heresies under the guise of piety and tradition. I understand why they would be disciplined. I get that. I understand why Rome would do that. But it makes no sense to discipline such a person like that unless liberals, radical extremist liberals in the church are also disciplined, like your Father James Martins. It makes no sense to discipline somebody who's like extreme rad trad without also extreme liberals. If you're going to engage in discipline, which I think church discipline is important and desperately needed. Historically, the church has always understood church discipline really, really important, because what good is a doctrine if it's not enforced? So discipline, I'm all on board, but there needs to be consistency. And it makes no sense to target one group with discipline and ignore another group, because in reality, the only reason why you have extreme radical traditionalists is because of they're reacting against the extreme liberals. Now, you can argue, well, maybe those extreme liberals were created because they were reacting against previous extreme radical traditionalists. Yeah, they probably feed into each other. The reality, however, is do away with the radical liberals in the church right now. Discipline them, excommunicate them, take away their faculties if they're in the clergy, remove them from ministry if they're bishops. Do that, I promise you, you will see less radical traditionalism. Traditionalism is good. Radical traditionalism, bad. Radical liberals, bad. It's important to be traditional and faithful to Catholic tradition. But sometimes people can fall off on, both ends of the spectrum, but it makes no sense to discipline one and not the other. Okay? So regardless of what your thoughts are on Traditionis Custodes, to me, I just think, oh man, this is concerning, because how is this going to come across to a lot of people now? Okay? Now that they find out the news, okay, he's not going to reverse Traditionis Custodes. What are they going to see next Sunday, however? They're still going to see pride masses when they go up and, look online and open up Twitter. They're still going to see that. Traditionis Custodes was a motu proprio, right? Have you ever seen a motu proprio against pride masses? Have you ever seen an encyclical against pride masses? Gosh, I would settle for a homily. Have you ever seen a papal homily against pride masses? Show me just one. Just one. A general audience? An off-the-cuff statement? I would love to see it. I've never seen it. Maybe it exists, but I've never seen it. But I have seen motu proprios against abuses in Latin Mass communities. I've seen a lot of papal homilies about that. I've seen a lot of documents. To me, that makes no sense. Whatever issues you might have over here, okay, I understand there's sometimes some issues, but we got to deal with this other stuff too. And I will remind everyone, hey, look, not everybody in the Latin Mass community is this radical traditionalist who's trying to weaponize the liturgy. That's not always the case. There are plenty of people who go to Latin Mass parishes who are on board with the magisterium. They're on board with the Second Vatican Council. They're not in dissent. They don't think that somehow they get more grace out of the Latin Mass. They don't think that the Novus Ordo is invalid, but they feel like it speaks to them more than the Novus Ordo, and that's fine. Look, if you feel like the Byzantine liturgy of Chrysostom speaks more to you than the Latin Mass or the Novus Ordo, that's fine. That's fine. Different people have different preferences. There's no issue with that. And there's plenty of people who go to Latin Mass community. They don't hold to that dissenting position. But the problem is they're being punished for the people who do, right? And that's not fair to them. Now, at the same time, again, I understand, well, Rome's goal is not just to weed out abuses. It's also to bring about uniformity to the Roman Rite, because it wants to have one liturgy instead of two. Well, okay. But other communities have multiple liturgies. So in theory, you could have that with the Roman Rite long term. But again, I would have less of a problem with the decision if I saw motu proprios prohibiting pride masses. Okay. But since we don't have that, this is not going to land well. So whoever was advising him on this, I don't know if they really advised him properly, because I think they're just looking at it from a very narrow angle. They're looking at, well, the bishop said this and there's some abuses here. They're looking at that, but they're not asking, well, what's the root problem? Well, the root problem is people are saying really bad abuses in the Novus Ordo, and that's not being addressed. That's not being dealt with. And they're reacting also against stuff like pride masses, and that needs to be addressed. What do we expect next? What can be expected? I do think that this is going to cause many people to turn on Pope Leo. Okay? I'm not anti-Pope Leo, despite what my critics say. You know how it is. People often misrepresent me. I rarely get a fair shake. I was never fully on board with everything Pope Francis said, right? I had my criticisms of him every week. But I also responded to fake news and fake criticisms against him as well. I do the same with Pope Leo. I've responded to fake news against Pope Leo. I'm also not on board with everything Pope Leo is doing. And as I pointed out, the magisterium allows for you to constructively offer some constructive and positive criticism. I stand by that. I haven't changed. A lot of other people have changed. I haven't changed. Those people, a lot of them have changed because they were hoping that under this pontificate, things would be very different. And they were waiting to see what he would do with this. Now that he hasn't done that, I do suspect, for better or worse, right or wrong, whether you like it or not, a lot of people are going to become a lot more vocal against Pope Leo. A lot of people who were kind of waiting and sitting by and on the fence, they're not going to be on the fence anymore after this. Along with that might come some constructive criticism of Pope Leo, which I welcome. But along with that will probably come a lot of fake news and destructive criticism, which I don't welcome. I don't think that's productive. A lot of people are going to resist this in the same way they just resisted that document that we just saw come out of the dicastery on the Virgin Mary. Do you see how many people were basically saying that they're just going to ignore the directives and continue to say, the Virgin Mary is co-redemptrix and all that? They just ignored it. The magisterium, for better or worse, has really lost its efficacy for almost everyone at this point. The liberals haven't been listening to the magisterium since Humanae Vitae. But, a lot of traditionalists haven't been listening to the magisterium since Pope Francis. And so you look at this new document now under Pope Leo, which is part of his ordinary papal magisterium, as he approved it in common form, on its decision on co-redemptrix, which we reviewed in a previous episode, not going to rehash that here. A lot of people have just said, I'm just going to ignore it, especially among, kind of the traditionalist end of the church. Not everybody, by the way, not all traditionalists. I've just seen some, right? Well, in the same way that people said, I'm just going to ignore that, there's going to be some others who just say, I'm just going to ignore this as well. And so what will they do? They'll probably go to the SSPX, where they'll have accessibility to the Latin Mass. They'll probably go SSPX. Some of them will probably go Eastern Orthodox and just abandon Catholicism altogether. I do think we're going to see that. Is this going to invite a mass exodus from the church? I don't know. But I do think that there will be people who leave the church over the issue, go to Eastern Orthodoxy, Oriental Orthodoxy, or whatever. I think that needs to be accounted for. I think that Rome needs to be aware of that. I don't know if that really means a whole lot these days for Rome. Because as I've pointed out, the magisterium in the post-conciliar period has been saying that people can be saved through the goodness found in other religions. Pope St. John Paul II explicitly said that. When you go that far, when you say that, at that point, really talking about differences between Catholics and Orthodox, you have to start to wonder, okay, what's the real reason? What's the point at this point if people could be saved through whatever goodness they find in Hinduism or something? I've, again, spoken about that at great length. I even have a free ebook on it at artccourses.com for you to go and read more if you don't know what I'm talking about. But Yeah, I think maybe Rome needs to be aware that this is probably going to drive some people away from the church. But honestly, at this point, I don't know if that really matters a whole lot to Rome, right? Does it really matter? Don't know. It's a fair question to ask. I do want to also make y'all aware, since we're talking about it, at rtcourses.com, my website where I have my lectures. I want to make y'all aware of the lecture I'm going to have on the question of doctrinal reversals. Can Catholic doctrine change? I have a lecture on this on November 22nd, 12 p.m. Central. It's the topic of my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Go ahead and reserve your spot, rtcourses.com, Can Catholic Doctrine Change? Once you purchase that, you'll get 40% off my magisterial studies program, which is all 30 lectures that I offer at a Catholic university on the topic of what the teaching authority of the church is, what the magisterium is, what it is, its history, all 21 ecumenical councils, major papal documents in 2,000 years, as well as how to read and evaluate magisterial documents. So if you want to finally understand how the magisterium works, this is the course for you, and take advantage of that 40% off coupon once you purchase my lecture, Can Catholic Doctrine Change? So that's rtcourses.com. Go and check it out. Which is certainly needed now, right? Especially when there's a lot of confusion on the question of the magisterium, not just with the most recent document on the Virgin Mary, but also with questions like Traditionis Custodes, how much authority does it have? You'll see people say something like quo primum, right? I even see it here in the live chat in the feed, and they'll say, hey, quote primum is irreformable, right? This is why you have to have that skill set of interpreting magisterial documents. Is quo primum irreformable? Some people are going to say, yeah, it is, and therefore the Novus Ordo is invalid. The Pope can't reform the Roman Rite because quo primum in the 1500s uses language that sounds like, the Pope can't change it. No, I've had videos talking about quo primum specifically, and we've gone over that question, but it goes back to the question of properly reading magisterial documents, knowing how to evaluate them and interpret them, and know what is and is not reformable in nature. So that course that I have coming up on November 22nd is certainly going to be relevant to it, but so are all those other lectures that I have with my magisterial studies program. So if this is stuff that's fascinating to you and you want to have that skill set to work through these questions, certainly go and check that out. And like I said, there's plenty of free resources on there as well. Anyways, those are my thoughts on the matter. I hope this was helpful. This is what we know so far. If there's any updates to the situation, I'll certainly let y'all know. I do want to hear your feedback and your thoughts. Do you think that this is a good move on his part? Do you think it's maybe not so good of a move? Do you think it's bad? Are you somewhere in the middle maybe? Kind of hold to a nuanced position for various reasons. I'd love to hear from you. So, of course, put your thoughts there in the comment section. I would like to receive your feedback. And please, as always, hit the subscribe button and hit the like button. All right, that's going to do it for now. God bless.